Hi guys, and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be showing you how you can use Blender to make 3D tracking and to put 3D objects in your scene. Alright, so if you're not familiar with Blender all that much, I do recommend you go and look up a starter tutorial on YouTube because it is quite a complicated program, and the stuff I'll be doing in this video is quite a bit more complicated than a lot of the basic stuff in Blender. So if you don't know that much about Blender, I do recommend you go and look at some tutorials online. But otherwise, let's just get right into it. So to start off with, we're just going to get rid of this splash screen just by clicking outside of it. And then all we're going to do is, before we change anything in here, we're just going to switch from our default screen layout into our motion tracking screen layout. And this will give us a whole different view on things. So once we're in our motion tracking layout, we need to open our footage, which we need to change. So click on this open, and then we need to scroll into wherever your footage is. And then we're just going to click open clip. Alright, so once we've got our clip imported, let's just zoom out a bit. As we can see, if we scroll through this video, it plays back pretty smoothly. My video only goes for 161 frames, so I'm going to change the end of the animation to be 161. Also, you can play back your video by pressing Alt A or Option A on a Mac on your keyboard. So the next thing we're going to do is motion track our footage. To do this, we need to find a number of points in our footage with which we can track. The ideal points for creating a really good track are ones that are high contrast and aren't too big. So if we can find a point that is really high contrast in our video, then that will be one of the best things that we can track. To add a track, simply press Add Marker and just click wherever you want your marker to be. Now you can move the marker around by just dragging on it. You can also scale it up by pressing S on your keyboard or moving points around individually. So now that I've got that one point in place, we can start to make it track through our video footage. To do this, just scroll down to your track menu here and press the track selected markers forward button. When you click that, it'll automatically go through your video and it'll track where that point is throughout the video. If you shoot your video in mind, knowing that you have to have some areas you want to track, then the better your video will be. Now you can go and individually add markers wherever you feel like there are some really nice high contrast points in your video. But there's also an easier way to do it if you didn't set any high contrast points in the beginning, or you just can't be bothered to go and select all of these high contrast points in your video. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use something called Detect Features. Down in our marker here, we can press Detect Features at the beginning of our video, and now it detects a bunch of points that Blender reckons it can track. So what we're going to do is we're just going to press the track forward button. It'll track forward for us until they're all done, and we can go through each one in our video. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and try and make as many markers as I can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the end of the video now. I'm once again going to detect features, and I'm going to this time track backwards so that this way I can track from the end of the video too. I'm now going to go into the middle, track forward and backward, etc., adding my own points, and you do the same, and we'll come back to you when I've finished with all my points. Alright guys, so I'm pretty much done tracking, and I've got a whole ton of points here. As you can see, most of them are in this smooth line, but some of them go jaggedy all over the place, such as this one right here. Now I've also got a bunch of points around the lighthouse, and the reason I don't want to have points on this lighthouse right here is because, as you can see, they take a different direction to the way that all of the ones are going. I'm not going to be putting anything on the lighthouse. Instead, I'm going to be putting my 3D object on the outside of the lighthouse. So the first thing we're going to do is delete all the markers that go through the lighthouse. To do this, right click and select on a marker and press X to delete it. Just go through this until you see all of the points on the lighthouse and simply delete them. Quick note, if you ever feel like you don't really know whether something should be deleted or not, just delete it. Less points that have good tracking information are better than more points that have somewhat okay tracking information. Alright, so now I've got all of the points that are on the lighthouse deleted. But as we scroll through our video, you can see that there are some points which just have a little error in the tracking. So what I'm going to do is delete those as best that I can. Alright guys, so I think I've pretty much done it, but oh, here we have one. Nope, it's this one. Nope, nope, this one.
A few moments later.
So now we're going to do a bit of cleanup in our video. First thing we're going to do is go down to our solve, and in our cleanup, what we're going to do is clean up tracks. So we can clean up tracks that are very short, for example, tracks that are 5 frames or less, and we can also clean up tracks that have a lot of error. So first we're going to select tracks that have 5 frames or less. When we press clean tracks, then it'll select the tracks that are very short. We can also make them delete them or delete the segments. We're just going to select them and manually delete them. Now we need to go into this little panel here, and we need to open up the camera and lens. If you know which camera you shot your video on, which you should definitely note down what focal length and what camera you are using to shoot your video, then you have to put it in here. If your camera doesn't come under these settings here, then what you can do is look up your sensor width and your pixel aspect, as well as looking up the focal length that you shot your video at. For example, 24 is a pretty wide focal length, or 100mm is a pretty zoomed in focal length. This is very important because the more you know, the better that Blender can work with your footage. However, if you don't really know what your camera settings are, then we can solve that right here. Now we're going to solve our camera motion. So to do this, don't press the button right yet. What we need to do is select an area of keyframes where you think there are really good tracks. I'm going to select the last, say, 120 to 150, because I think that they have a pretty good track. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and refine. So if you don't know the focal length or the optical center or any of that stuff from your camera, you can select this. Also, you can select the distortion and refine the distortion of your camera lens, but mostly you'll just want to select the focal length and the optical center. If you do know and you've filled in all of these presets here, then you won't need to select anything to refine. Next, what you're going to do is simply press Solve Camera Motion. Once you've done this, it'll solve the camera motion for you, and you'll come up with a solve error of 2.5411, etc. Now, the lower this solve error is, the better the track you'll get. Anything under 3 has a decent chance of getting tracked well. What we can do now is go back into our cleanup section and select frames that have an error of 2 or higher. Then we can select those tracks and we can possibly delete them. In fact, because there are quite a lot of tracks with an error of 2, I'm just going to go and make it say 2.3. And that way we'll deselect everything by pressing A and again select some tracks. So I'm just going to go and delete all of those. And now we've only got a bunch of tracks, but they're pretty good tracks. If we go and solve our camera motion once again, you can see that we get a better solve error. Alright, so now is the tricky bit. Here's where we convert our tracking points into a real 3D plane. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to set the floor, an origin, and the scale. And these are all going to be pretty important. So the first thing we're going to have to do is set something to be the floor. So to set something to be the floor, you have to set 3 points in a triangle sort of shape, and those 3 points must be at a flat plane, on a flat plane with each other. So to do this, we're going to select 3 points such as this, this, and this, and we're just going to set it to be the floor. I don't know how well this will work, and we can always try things later, but let's just set those to be the floor for now. Then we're going to set, say, this point to be our origin, and that is pretty much all that we need to do. You can also set 3 points to be a wall in your scene if you have a wall in your scene, and that makes it easier for Blender to work out things. But I don't have a wall in my scene, so everything should be good. Now we're going to go down here. I'm going to set the scale to be 3 or so between these 2 points, just by setting the scale to be 3 and pressing set scale. Now we're going to set as background, which means that we're going to set this video as our background when we're editing with the camera view, as we'll get to later. And we're also going to press set up tracking scene, which is where the magic happens. Just press it and your tracking scene is created. Make sure to save your work. Now don't touch anything, we're just going to go straight from motion tracking back to default. And if we look around, we can see all of our tracking points and our default cube and plane. So because all of our tracking points are this way, I don't think we got that good of a track. The reason being is because this is the floor of our video, and we need to align this floor to be along this floor. Let's just go into our camera mode by pressing 0 on your number keypad, or if you don't have one, go into view and camera, and you can see that it is indeed wonky. But on the bright side, if we scroll through, we can see that it tracks well with our video. Now the real trick here is to find a good floor that we can use to set the plane at that point. So let's go back to our motion tracking, and let's try and select another point to be our plane. I'm going to select this, and in fact I'm going to select this, and this to be our floor. Press floor. I'm going to set this to be the origin, and let's go back into our default. We can see it's better, but it's still not perfect. There's still a lot of things wrong with it. So you're just going to have to try and play around with it and try and find a really good floor and also a really good wall for you to set up your tracking scene in. One thing that will help with this is if you go back into your camera, look at sort of how it needs to be rotated. For example, does it need to be rotated sort of, you know, on the x-axis a bit like that, to make it more upright? In that case, all we have to do is try and find 2 points that or 3 points that are on this axis. So for example, these 3 points. So I'm going to try and locate these points in the motion tracker, and I'm going to then set those to be the floor. So going back into our motion tracking, I seem to remember that this point, and this point are all on a relatively flat plane in our default setting here. So I'm going to set those to be the floor, going to set this, or I'm going to set that to be the origin, and if we go back into our default, it's stuffed up completely. So let's go back into our motion tracking. I don't know, let's maybe set that as the origin, perhaps these 3 as the floor, go back into our default, and everything's stuffed up once again. So we just have to mess around with these settings to see which works best. Alright guys, so now I found what I think is a pretty good track. Tracks pretty well. I'm pretty happy with the position of the plane. Maybe it should be rotated a little bit more, but we can fiddle around with this later. But the thing I want to get down right now is actually the transparency. So if you go and render this as it is, and it depends on where you are right now, but if you go ahead and render this, and you find that you've got this shadow under here, then that's brilliant. You don't need to change anything at all. But if you do not have a shadow, and instead you have this big plane of a shadow that you see, then you need to follow these steps. First, what you need to do is go into your materials, and you need to create a new material. Then, this is once you've selected the plane, of course. Then once you've done this, you're going to have to go and press new material to create a new material. And then you're going to have to click on transparency, just make it all of the default things, and also go down to shadows, and make sure you press shadows only, and shadows only once again. And this way, you should be good to go. Alright, so we've pretty much got everything in position, and you could render a bunch of frames like this with a cube sitting in a field. But for me, that's just a bit uninteresting. So we're going to be adding a 3D model from online, and from a specific website. This website is called blendswap.com. It's got some really cool stuff, and it's one of the best websites for Blender models that there is. Everything is free. You can sign up for an account and get as many models as you want. Often you have to credit the author of the model, but it doesn't really matter because there are all sorts of really cool models out there. The model I'm going to be using in this video is the Retro Rocket by T4K1T, or whatever, and it is a pretty good model. It works in Blender Render instead of Cycles Render, but you can work with models which work in Cycles or Blender Render. It doesn't really matter. All you have to do is download this blend by signing up or creating an account, and then once you've downloaded the Blender, then we have to import it into our project. So let's get into how we do that. So how do we add this model into our scene? Well, the answer is pretty simple. We have to append it. So simply go File, Append, and once you've done this, just navigate to where that file is. And here we're going to go into the Retro Rocket. Make sure you unzip the zip file, by the way. And once you've done that, just click on your Blender file, and you'll be able to open up all these things in your Blender file. Just go to your object, and press A to select everything. Now we don't need everything, so what we're going to do is press Shift to get rid of the camera. We don't need the camera. There's also a sun here that we don't need, and a Hemi too. These are all lights and a camera. We don't need all of these because we're going to be adding our own in a second, as you will see later. So then we need to just click Append from Library. Once we've got all of that, let's just move it up so it's out of the way. But there's one more step to this. Let's go File, Append, once again, and go back, and now we're going to go into our materials, and in our materials, this is where we'll find, obviously, all the materials. So, this is where you get this is how you make it look realistic. So press A to select all of your materials, and simply press Append from Library. And now, if you go into Rendered, it should show up, but if it doesn't show up, then it's probably because of this. As you can see, if we go back into Solid View, and let's just select all of this stuff right here. So by pressing B, we can select all of this stuff. In fact, we're going to go out of this mode right here, and we're going to select all of this stuff by pressing B on the keyboard and simply dragging. And we go back into our camera here, and we can see that if we switch between layers, it is on the second layer. And everything on the second layer sort of acts as that shadowy thing, and doesn't really act as a normal thing would. It just provides a shadow. So we're going to press M, and we're going to move it into the top layer right here. You may not have needed to do this. Maybe it was in this layer for you, but if not, then just press Rendered, and you can see that now we've got a nice spaceship rendered up in the middle of nowhere. So now we're going to position it right in our frame. So we're going to get rid of these lights, and once we've got rid of all these lights, we're going to get rid of all of that too, because that's just part of the model. And we're going to select all of this by pressing B once again. And if we go into our camera view by pressing View Camera or again numpad 0, then we can just move this down right onto the plane here. If we select both layers, we can see where the plane is. We're just going to move it so it just touches the plane. And we're also going to delete the cube. So now if we go into rendered, we can see that it sits right there. And if we create an actual render, we'll be able to see that it has a shadow as well, as you can see right there. So what we're going to go and do now is we're going to position it properly, because it's not really correctly positioned. So I'm going to go ahead and select B, select all of this plane and stuff, and I'm just going to rotate it on the, rotate it on the y-axis so that it lines up with the way that our scene lines up properly. And I'm also going to rotate it on the z-axis, and that way we'll be able to see whether it lines up with the horizon. So let's go rotate on the x-axis, and that way the plane lines up with the horizon, as you can see. And I'm now just going to rotate on the z-axis.
2 hours later.
I think it looks pretty good. All I'm going to do now is I'm just going to make it a bit closer. So let's go back into global mode. Oh, and move the plane with it too. Just a bit closer so that we can see it more easily. So if we go back into rendered mode, looks pretty nice. If we actually render it, then it should also look pretty nice. So if you're happy with the perspective and everything on that, then that should be fine. Hopefully you've come this far already. Now what we're going to do is just make it so that this sort of fits in with our scene just a little bit better. So if we go into our textured mode again, or into our solid mode so it's easier to edit, I think that when we render it, as you can see, I don't think the light is quite strong enough, because it's quite a bright light, and everything's quite bright. I don't actually know why it's so bright. The original video's not quite this bright, but we're just going to compensate it for it right here. So what we're going to do is, in our light in our scene here, as you can see with this lighthouse sort of thing, the shadow is going in that certain direction. So we're going to try and replicate that with this ship here. First we're going to make it into a sun, and then we're going to say move it here and rotate it along the z-axis. Also going to make it about 10 on the energy scale. If we go back into our camera, if we just go ahead and maybe render this, then we can see the light's a lot brighter, which I like. And also I do think that the shadow, I don't know, let's just go back to say this frame where we can compare the shadows a bit better. Let's render it out. And I reckon that's pretty good. Now I could make some more changes to this, but I think that this tutorial has been long enough already as it is. So I do wish you all the best when you're making your own of these. I know that today's tutorial was a bit different, and it also was a lot more complicated. I know a lot of you guys are going to have problems with this. Blender just works in that way. It just gives you problems and you're meant to sort them out yourself. So I hope you guys found this video helpful. Next week we'll have another hit film video back up, and thank you guys for watching. I will see you guys next time. Stay shiny. Bye.